For her entire life, Elizabeth had to curtsy every time she entered or left a room with her grandmother in it. Then, in 4 minutes, everything reversed, and you can see the exact moment none of it seemed real anymore. But here's what most people miss when they watch that scene. The curtsy isn't really about Queen Mary. It's not even, ultimately, about Elizabeth. It's about a man who isn't in the room. A man who died in his sleep at Sandringham House in the early hours of February 6, 1952, his heart stopping from coronary thrombosis just months after lung cancer surgery. A man who never wanted the crown, who spent 16 years carrying it anyway, whose death triggered every reversal you see on screen. King George VI, Elizabeth's father. The stammering second son who became the symbol of British resilience through the worst war in human history. The curtsy scene devastates because it shows you what his death meant, not abstractly, constitutionally, physically, in the bodies of the women he left behind. To understand why, you have to understand who he was, and who he was starts with who he wasn't supposed to be. Born Albert Frederick Arthur George on December 14, 1895, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, he was the second son of the Duke of York, the man who would become King George V. Second sons in the British monarchy have a very specific function. They exist as insurance. They're the spare to the heir. They're raised with royal discipline, but without royal destiny. The assumption, from the moment of Albert's birth, was that his older brother Edward would ascend the throne, marry appropriately, produce heirs, and continue the line. Albert's job was to stand behind, support the institution, and fade into the comfortable obscurity of a minor royal. Nobody prepared him to be king. Nobody thought they needed to. What they did instead was try to fix him, because from early childhood, something was clearly wrong. Albert developed a severe stammer, a speech impediment so pronounced it made public speaking an ordeal and private conversation frequently painful. The causes remain debated by medical historians. Some point to his strict upbringing under a father who demanded perfection and showed affection rarely. Others note that he was naturally left-handed but forced to write with his right, a common practice, then, that some researchers have linked to speech disorders. Still others suggest the stammer may have had neurological origins, unrelated to his environment. What's not debated is how it shaped him. George V was not a warm father. Contemporary accounts describe him as gruff, demanding, emotionally remote. He expected his sons to meet Naval standards of discipline and deportment, and when they fell short, he let them know. My father was frightened of his mother, I was frightened of my father, and I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me, George V reportedly said. Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment captured the household atmosphere. Albert's stammer was, in his father's eyes, a deficiency to be overcome through willpower. The boy was subjected to treatment after treatment, each more humiliating than the last. Speech therapists of the era had little understanding of the neurological and psychological complexity of stammering. Some prescribed breathing exercises that did nothing. Others tried mechanical devices. One popular approach involved placing marbles or pebbles in the patient's mouth while speaking, a technique borrowed from the ancient Greek orator Demosthenes, applied without any understanding of why it had supposedly worked for him or whether it had any relevance to a 20th century child. None of it helped. The stammer persisted. And with it persisted Albert's acute awareness of his own inadequacy, at least in the terms his father defined adequacy. His older brother Edward, by contrast, seemed to have everything: charm, charisma, ease with people. The Golden Prince of the 1920s, photographed everywhere, adored by crowds across the empire during his tours. Edward was what royalty was supposed to look like. Albert was what happened when the mold didn't quite set. So Albert did what second sons do. He served in the Royal Navy during the First World War, seeing action at the Battle of Jutland on May 31st, 1916, one of the largest naval battles in history, where the British Grand Fleet clashed with the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. He was a turret officer aboard HMS Collingwood, and though illness had plagued his naval career, he'd had surgery for a duodenal ulcer, he insisted on being at his post during the engagement. He later transferred to the Royal Naval Air Service and then the Royal Air Force, earning his pilot's wings in 1919, the first member of the royal family to be certified as a pilot. But it was what he did in the 1920s that most people have forgotten. Because while Edward was charming crowds and collecting admirers, Albert was doing something genuinely unusual for a prince. He was visiting factories. Starting in 1919, Albert became president of the Industrial Welfare Society, an organization dedicated to improving working conditions in British manufacturing. This wasn't ceremonial. He toured factories across the country, coal mines, textile mills, shipyards, steel plants. He talked to workers. He inspected conditions. He asked questions about ventilation, safety equipment, housing. He became so associated with industrial matters that the press nicknamed him the Industrial Prince. And then, in 1921, he did something even more remarkable. He founded the Duke of York's camps. The idea was simple and radical. Bring together boys from elite public schools and boys from working-class industrial backgrounds for a week of activities at a summer camp. No distinctions of class, no separation by background. Sons of factory owners doing the same activities, singing the same songs, eating the same food as sons of factory workers. The camps ran every summer from 1921 to 1939, except for 1930, when Albert had a near-fatal bout of illness. Each camp brought together approximately 200 boys, half from industry and half from schools. They were held at various locations: New Romney in Kent, Southwold in Suffolk, later at Balmoral in Scotland. Albert attended every single one, not as a distant patron. He showed up. He joined in the campfire singing. He learned the camp song, which included the lyrics, "Under canvas, we'll be happy," and reportedly sang it with genuine enthusiasm, his stammer somehow less pronounced when singing than when speaking. The camps were, in their modest way, a kind of social experiment. Could you break down class barriers, even temporarily, through shared experience? Albert believed you could. The camps became one of the things he was proudest of. But none of this, the naval service, the factory visits, the camps, prepared him for October 31st, 1925. The British Empire exhibition at Wembley was closing. Nearly 2 years of celebrating imperial achievement, industrial progress, the global reach of British commerce and culture. Albert had been asked to deliver the closing speech, to be broadcast live on radio across the empire, one of the first major royal addresses transmitted to a mass audience. It was a disaster. The speech itself was brief, fewer than 200 words, but Albert struggled through nearly every one of them. He paused. He fought for consonants. He repeated syllables. The silences stretched. Listeners across Britain heard their prince labor through sentences that should have taken seconds, but stretched into what felt like minutes. The humiliation was complete and utterly public. After Wembley, everything changed. The Duke and his wife Elizabeth began searching desperately for someone who could help, someone whose methods actually worked. They found Lionel Logue. Logue was Australian, an elocution teacher from Adelaide who had developed unconventional techniques while treating shell-shocked soldiers during the First World War. He had no medical degree. His methods were dismissed by some in the British medical establishment as unscientific. But he had a waiting list of patients who swore by his results. Albert's first appointment with Logue was on October 19, 1926, at Logue's consulting room on Harley Street. What Logue saw immediately was what the medical establishment had missed. Albert's stammer was as much psychological as physical. The tension in his jaw, throat, and chest was creating a self-reinforcing cycle of anxiety and impediment. Fear of stammering made the stammering worse. Logue's approach combined breathing exercises, muscle relaxation, and, crucially, psychological support. He insisted Albert practice an hour a day. He had him strengthen his diaphragm through specific breathing techniques. He worked on reducing the tension that preceded difficult consonants. But most importantly, he treated Albert as an equal. He called him Bertie in their sessions. He was irreverent, direct, occasionally blunt. He treated the stammer as a mechanical problem to be solved, not a character flaw to be ashamed of. The progress was slow, but real. Albert would never be a natural orator. He would always have to work harder than other speakers. But by 1927, he could deliver a speech without the catastrophic breakdowns of Wembley. He could function in his role. And then, a decade later, he needed those skills more desperately than Logue or anyone else could have imagined. George V died on January 20th, 1936. Edward became King Edward.It. The Golden Prince was finally the Golden King. Except he wasn't. He was a 41-year-old man in love with Wallis Simpson, an American, a divorcee, a woman the Church of England and the British government considered constitutionally impossible as a queen consort. Edward had a choice, the crown or the woman. He chose the woman. Albert learned he would become king just weeks before it happened. The abdication was formalized on December 10th, 1936. The following day, December 11th, Albert was proclaimed King George VI. He chose that regnal name deliberately, a signal of continuity with his father, a rejection of the chaos his brother had caused. But choosing a name doesn't make you ready. The new king was 41 years old, terrified of public speaking, and utterly unprepared for the role thrust upon him. His wife reportedly told a friend that what Edward had done was unforgivable. Not because he'd chosen love, but because he'd chosen it knowing full well the cost to his brother. The man with the stammer would now have to speak for the nation. The man who'd spent his life in the shadows would now have to stand in the brightest light. His mother, Queen Mary, felt the betrayal perhaps even more keenly. Born Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes on May 26, 1867, she had spent her entire life in service to monarchy. She'd been engaged to one prince, Albert Victor, who died of influenza in January 1892, then transferred her engagement to his brother George, the man who became George V. She'd married him on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. She'd produced 6 children, Edward in 1894, Albert in 1895, Mary in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and John in 1905. John, the son no one talked about, diagnosed with epilepsy, hidden away at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, cared for by a nanny, rarely seen by the rest of the family. He died on January 18, 1919. He was 13. Mary's letter about his death contained the Victorian ambivalence that defined her emotional expression. "Our poor little Johnny has passed away suddenly," while noting, "his malady was becoming much worse, and he has thus been spared much suffering." And now Edward, the son who was supposed to carry the crown, had thrown it away for an American divorcee. Mary supported George VI's decision to effectively banish his brother. The Duke of Windsor was forbidden from returning to Britain without permission. His wife would never be styled Her Royal Highness. Mary never saw Wallis Simpson again, never acknowledged the marriage as legitimate. Then, less than 3 years into George VI's reign, war came. Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The king was 53 days past his 43rd birthday. He would spend the next 6 years as a symbol of national endurance through bombing raids, rationing, and devastating losses. His relationship with Winston Churchill, the prime minister who would come to define wartime leadership, started uneasily. George VI had actually preferred Lord Halifax for the position when Neville Chamberlain resigned in May 1940. The king found Churchill somewhat unpredictable, his reputation tarnished by past political failures. But as the war ground on, something shifted. They began meeting every Tuesday. Lunch at Buckingham Palace, just the two of them. No secretaries, no advisors. 2 men who could speak candidly about the weight they carried. Churchill later wrote that he valued these lunches enormously. The king offered a perspective no one else could, a sounding board who understood duty in a way that transcended politics. George VI, in turn, came to admire Churchill's unflinching resolve. When the bombs fell on London, when the news from the front was catastrophic, when it seemed the entire enterprise might collapse, Churchill never wavered, at least not publicly. The king recognized something of himself in that, the performance of steadiness when everything inside screamed to panic. When Buckingham Palace was hit by German bombs on September 13, 1940, Queen Elizabeth reportedly said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." They stayed in London through the Blitz. They visited bombed neighborhoods. They ate rationed food. They performed shared sacrifice with a consistency that helped define how Britain saw itself. And George VI broadcast. This was perhaps the cruelest demand the war made of him. The king, who could barely get through a sentence without his throat closing up, was expected to address the nation by radio, to steady nerves, stiffen spines, remind millions why they were fighting. Logue was brought in for every major speech. He would sit just out of microphone range, providing silent support while George fought through each sentence. The Christmas broadcasts became national events. Families gathered around wireless sets to hear their monarch speak. The broadcasts were not smooth. You can hear the effort in surviving recordings, the careful spacing of words, the slight hesitations, the moments where he's clearly fighting his own throat. But he did it, year after year. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, George VI wanted desperately to be there. Both he and Churchill had contemplated crossing the Channel with the invasion forces. Both were talked out of it by advisors who pointed out the obvious. The death or capture of either would be catastrophic for morale. So the king waited, and that evening he addressed the nation. 4 years ago, our nation and empire stood alone against an overwhelming enemy, with our backs to the wall, he said. Now once more a supreme test has to be faced. This time, the challenge is not to fight to survive, but to fight to win the final victory for the good cause. Every word deliberate, every pause calculated. The stammer held at bay through sheer will and years of Logue's training. The war ended, Britain won, and George VI was exhausted. The strain showed physically by the late 1940s. Arteriosclerosis caused severe leg pain. Surgery in 1949 helped temporarily. Then came the cancer. In September 1951, surgeons removed his entire left lung after discovering a malignant tumor. The public was told about structural changes. The reality was grimmer. By early 1952, he seemed to be recovering. Well enough that Elizabeth and Philip departed for Kenya on January 31st, beginning a tour that would take them to Australia and New Zealand. On February 5th, the king went shooting at Sandringham. A good day. Reasonable spirits. Sometime in the early hours of February 6th, a blood clot formed in his heart. He died in his sleep, 56 years old. King for 15 years, 2 months, and 1 day. Elizabeth learned the news at Treetops, a remote lodge where she'd been watching wildlife. Her private secretary, Martin Charteris, was informed first. He told Philip. Philip told Elizabeth. No detailed record of her reaction exists, just the composure witnesses noted. She flew back immediately, changing into black on the plane. She'd packed nothing suitable for mourning. The coffin made its slow journey from Sandringham to London. The king's body lay in state at Westminster Hall for 3 days. More than 300,000 people filed past to pay respects, the queues stretching for miles through London's February cold. Before the funeral, Elizabeth had to face the Accession Council, the formal body that officially proclaims a new sovereign. She stood before them on February 8th, just 2 days after her father's death, and delivered her declaration. By the sudden death of my dear father, I am called to assume the duties and responsibilities of sovereignty. 25 years old, reading formal words while grief was still raw, and at some point in those first devastating days, she saw her grandmother, Queen Mary, 84 years old, a woman who had buried her husband George V in 1936, her son John in 1919, her son George in 1942, when his RAF flying boat crashed into a Scottish hillside. A woman who had enforced Victorian protocol with what one biographer called a dignity that could freeze at 20 paces. Protocol now demanded, when Queen Mary entered a room where Elizabeth was present, she would curtsy, not the reverse. The woman who had spent 8 decades being curtsied to would lower herself to a 25-year-old. In The Crown, Peter Morgan compresses all of this into 4 minutes. Eileen Atkins plays Mary with tremendous physical fragility, but absolute resolve. Dressed in black, moving slowly. When she enters the room where Elizabeth waits, played by Claire Foy, there's a pause. And then Mary curtsies. Near silence. The creak of floorboards. No score, just bodies moving through a room. The sound design forces you to feel the physical weight of deference. Watch Claire Foy's feet. There's a twitch. The slightest movement, as if her body, trained for 25 years to respond to this woman's presence, almost curtsies back. Muscle memory doesn't know constitutional law. That twitch is the thesis made physical. None of it seems real yet. There's another detail most miss. Princess Margaret waits, steps back so Philip can walk behind Elizabeth first. When George VI was alive, Margaret outranked Philip. Now Philip is husband of the sovereign. The entire geometry has shifted. Queen Mary lived 13 more months. She died March 24th, 1953, 10 weeks before Elizabeth's coronation on June 2nd. Too ill to attend, she'd specified the ceremony shouldn't be delayed. Even at the end, duty first. So when this scene devastates you, when you feel something you can't name, now you have the vocabulary. You're watching the weight George VI carried pass to his daughter. The father who fought his voice to speak for a nation at war, who took the throne his brother abandoned, who visited factories and founded camps and struggled through every broadcast. His mother curtsies to his daughter. Everything he was, every sacrifice, every struggle, compressed into this moment of reversal. 4 minutes to reverse what his death made true. Subscribe for more stories like this.